In his presence there is comfort. In his presence there is peace. When we seek the Father's heart, we will find such blessed assurance in the presence of the Lord.
Good morning and welcome to Unveiled, a presentation of the Church Street Church of Christ in Lewisburg, Tennessee. Unveiled is simply a one-on-one conversation between Christian people designed to help each of us, as followers of Christ, become more aware of and better respond to the presence of God at work in our daily lives. Okay, my guest today is Don Ledford. And Don, first of all, I want to thank you for taking some time to be with me today.
You bet. Thanks for asking me, Kyle.
All right. Don, why don't you take just a few minutes here at the beginning of our conversation and just introduce yourself to me and to our listening audience, as if there may be some listeners who don't know who you are. What would you like us to know about Don Ledford?
Well, I am Don Ledford. I grew up on a farm in the Mooresville community. Learned a lot of life's lessons while working on the farm, and had wonderful parents that cared for me and my sister, and just a happy time in my life. I'm married to Betsy Moss. Betsy and I have been married 51 years, and we have two children. Our daughter lives in Alpharetta, Georgia with her family, and our son Clayton lives in Murfreesboro with his family, and we have 6 grandchildren.
And do you have opportunity to see your children much?
Well, COVID has kind of interrupted that just a little bit. We do get to see the families in Murfreesboro quite often, but Alpharetta is a little bit different story.
Now, that's north of Atlanta?
Correct.
So about how long of a drive is it for you to go visit family there?
It takes us about 4.5 hours to get there, if you get through Chattanooga.
Okay. I've been through that way, so I know how that can be.
Yeah.
So before COVID, were you able to get down that way, or were they able to get here very often?
We usually tried maybe once a month to be with her family, and either they came to Lewisburg or we went there. So that's kind of how it averaged out.
So you said that you and Betsy have been married 51 years. You grew up in the Mooresville community. Did she also grow up in the Mooresville community, or where did you meet her?
No, so we were high school sweethearts.
Okay.
And she's a city girl all the way. So that's kind of an oddity of how we got together. But anyway, it's a good match, and she's my rock.
All right. Well, we'll talk more about that in a little bit. What I'm interested in knowing at the beginning here is I'd like for you to look back into your childhood, your growing up years, I'll put it that way, and think about during your time in the Mooresville community and growing up on the farm, what was your religious life like, and when did that become something that was real to you?
Well, I mentioned earlier that growing up on the farm, I learned a lot of lessons that have served me well as an adult. But as a young boy, I grew up in the Methodist Church. Both of my parents were very religious people, believed in God. Had a strong relationship with God. But later I got to asking myself some questions, got to more serious about studying the Bible and what the Bible really says to man, and that's when I made the change.
So when you were a child and you were going to church with your parents, were you regular attenders?
Oh, absolutely.
Every Sunday kind of people?
Mom and Dad were the type of folks, and my dad was a member of the Lord's church. So I grew up in a somewhat split household, religiously speaking. But both my mom and dad were very devoted in their belief. And it wasn't a question of are we going to church on Sunday? That just wasn't debated.
Okay. And so is your sister older or younger than you?
My sister is older.
So it was just the two of you children.
Correct.
And so as far as you can remember back, even when you were young children, you were churchgoers.
Oh, absolutely.
So you said your dad was a member of the Church of Christ?
Correct.
And your mother was a member of the Methodist Church.
Correct.
So when they went to church, when the family went, you all went to the Methodist Church, is that correct?
Correct.
And at what age would you say you were when you started to question that for yourself?
That's a good question. Probably mid to late teens. When you're exposed to a belief, perhaps it's your belief or perhaps it's your parents' belief, mm-hmm. and then you start exploring. Well, why is it that way? So there are things that if you ask a Methodist, for example, and they're in conversation with someone who is a member of the Lord's church, they'll say, well, we believe the same thing. But after you look at it, well, you don't practice the same thing. Belief and practice are two different things. And so I guess that's what got me to questioning who I was and what I believed and what I wanted to believe and what I thought the Bible was really saying to me.
Was there someone, maybe a peer or a group of peers that were influential religiously for you during those years?
Well, Betsy and I, we started dating, I guess I was a junior in high school. And somewhere along the way, I don't really remember when, probably senior or maybe even after I had gone off to school, we started having religious conversations and what the Bible says and what the Bible means and what is required of man, those types of things. And I began going with Betsy to worship on Sunday mornings. And I would listen to a message here at Church Street, and then she would go to her Bible class, and then I would go to the Methodist Church in Mooresville. And again, you just start asking things and start comparing, and that's how I got my own religion, I guess.
So there was a period of time when you were attending both the Church of Christ and the Methodist Church each Sunday?
It was.
And so you had ample opportunity, I guess, to see two completely different styles, I would assume, of worship from 1 hour to the next.
Correct. In the same day.
So once you started feeling the tuggings on your heart, did you sit down and study the Bible with a preacher or a member, or did you just kind of reach your conclusions on your own?
Reached my conclusion on my own.
Okay. So you've mentioned Betsy, and you've been happily married for, I think you said 51 years.
That's correct.
So did you first meet her in high school?
We did. She was a cheerleader, and I played every kind of sport they had. So it was kind of a natural. And really and truly, I guess I owe my sister a great debt. She encouraged me to ask Betsy out for a date. So how did your life paths? You mentioned you were completely opposite as far as upbringing. You being a farm boy and her being a city girl. Other than school itself, how did your paths cross, and what part do you think God may have played in making sure those paths intersected? Well, if you go back and look at our childhood, both of our childhoods. Betsy was born in Cookeville. Her family moved to Lewisburg, I think, when she was 4 or 5 years old. And she tells the story that she didn't want to leave Cookeville because all of her cousins were there. And my growing up on the farm, a farm boy and a city girl, it seems unlikely that those paths would ever cross, but they did. We started talking at a ball game one night while we were in high school, and just seemed to be natural conversation between the both of us.
Did you know each other before you started talking at this ball game?
I knew who she was. I kid her all the time and tell her she didn't know me from Adam. But she said, well, I knew you. You played ball. But at any rate, yeah, we knew each other. But she, Betsy's a year ahead of me in school. So, again, we didn't really have a lot of classes together. In fact, I don't think we ever had a class together in high school. But it was a match made for her.
So you said your sister was influential in getting that started. What did she do?
Well, Betsy was on in a parade and on a float, and I think it was a Christmas parade. And I happened to be, and I'm not a parade person, so there again, that's kind of weird in itself. I was at that parade, and I was standing beside my sister, and I don't remember why the circumstance was that my sister and I were standing together at a parade. But she said, look at that pretty girl on that float. You need to ask her out for a date. And it was a while before I got up my courage, but I finally did.
Did she know Betsy personally?
No.
So it was just a kind of a jab at you at a parade that got you thinking. Had you already noticed her before then?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Didn't take you long to answer that question.
No.
All right. So looking back in your childhood, your religious upbringing, as we've already talked about, and your meeting Betsy, did you sense at any time the working of God in your life at that point? I know you must have believed in the existence of God.
Absolutely.
But did you sense that God was actively working in your life at any time during those growing up years?
Not really.
So when you look back on it, can you see the hand of God and the things that have happened? And what is a clue to you now in your level of spiritual maturity as you look back? What do you think God was up to back then? Well,
I think we were brought together for a purpose. We've had a good life together. We're very proud of both of our children. I think together we did a good job in getting them established and making them responsible adults and God-believing adults.
So all during your married life, I assume then that you've always been active members of the church.
Yes. Betsy and I, we lived in Cookeville for a year. When we got married, I lacked a year of undergraduate school. Betsy was in graduate school. We completed that. We moved from Cookeville to Pulaski, lived there a couple of 3 years, and then moved back to Lewisburg. Started raising our family, and as they say, the rest is history.
So you both went to the same college?
No. Betsy, she did her undergraduate work at Lipscomb, and I went to MTSU for 3 years. And
were y'all dating each other during this time, or were you already married at this time?
I lacked a year of undergraduate school before we got married, and Betsy lacked 1 year of graduate school. Yes, we were dating. We've been dating, or had dated, since I was a junior in high school.
Okay. And that was pretty steady from then on forward. No.
as steady as we could make it.
Okay. All right. So Betsy got her degree in
Psychology, guidance, and our master's is in guidance and counseling.
Okay. And your degree was in what?
Business management.
Okay. And so tell us a little bit about your work history.
Well, my work history is not too long in that I worked for one employer my entire career.
Wow.
44 and a half years for Tennessee Farmers Cooperative. I had several different jobs in that 44 and a half years, but I spent my entire working career for one company.
Boy, how rare is that these days?
Well, my children marvel at that now.
It is pretty impressive. So your first employer was also your last employer and nothing in between.
Nothing in between.
That's pretty impressive. So what ways did you see God at work during your work career, all those years, 44 and a half years with the same company?
Well, number one, I worked for a very stable company. It's grassroots. Agriculture is pretty basic, and some of the finest people in the whole wide world I got to come in contact with. Worked for some excellent people that I reported to, and I learned very much from them. From the standpoint of how God was at work in that, I can remember as a young boy, I can recall the day very vividly even now. I was helping my dad put some fertilizer on corn, I think it was. And I was reading on the bag of fertilizer, Laverne, Tennessee Farmers Cooperative, Laverne, Tennessee. And I asked my dad, I said, who are they and what is that? And he explained to me what cooperative was and who they served, this, that, and the other. And I said, I want to work for them. And I couldn't have been over 13 or 14 years old. And lo and behold, I did.
Interesting. Now, I'm a city boy, as you well know.
Yes.
So explain to me what this company is and what they do.
Well, Tennessee Farmers Cooperative is a farm supply, input agriculture, feed, seed, fertilizer, pretty basic, and then all the components that go with it for ag production in Tennessee.
So did you go around selling the product, or what was your role in all of this, at least at different times?
Oh, well, it depends on what year. I started out as what Tennessee farmers refer to as a management training program. That was the reason we lived in Pulaski. And from there, I went to an area agronomist, assistant manager of a department, to a manager of a department, to manager of another department, to manager of another department, and ultimately I wound up my career in financial analysis.
So when I first met you, I believe you were commuting from here to Laverne. Was that right?
That's correct.
And then there was a point where you were able to stay here in Lewisburg and still work remotely.
Yeah, I commuted to Laverne probably 30 years.
Oh, okay.
And I just one day out of the blue, management came in and said, would you like to have your office in Lewisburg? And I said, would I? And that's when I went in another direction for the company, but still with the same company. And of course, by that time, everything was done over telephone, fax machine, or internet. So it really didn't matter where I was stationed, and they gave me the opportunity, and I was very appreciative of that.
Especially with the experiences our country and really the world has had with this COVID-19 outbreak. That has become more the norm for a lot of business now. Instead of working on site, a lot of people working off site now.
You bet. Yep.
So it's interesting to just hear your story, Don, because even though you and I have very different backgrounds and very different experiences, I'm convinced that all of life is a journey, that we start on a journey to meet and to have a relationship with God, and that God is very much a part of offering us doorways to walk through, opportunities to seize, whether we seize them or not. And so it seems to me that even out of all the other people that I get a chance to visit with, that we all have very different experiences, upbringings. But when we look back as Christians, we can see that God has always been a part of our lives, even when we didn't recognize it, that things don't just happen coincidentally, that God has directed us, and we get to choose. We do have free choice. We choose whether we accept the nudgings and the leadings along the way, maybe not even recognizing them as nudgings and leadings at the time. But part of the purpose of this program is we want to try to challenge ourselves first, and then anyone who might be listening, to look back and to see how God has brought us from point A to point B. And I find it fascinating even now, even today, that you and I sit here talking to one another, and though we didn't know anything about each other 10 years ago, our paths have intersected, and I would like to think that we've both been blessed by that.
You bet. I certainly have.
So it's fascinating to see how God has always been working, and I hope that as you and I both mature, even from this point forward in our spiritual walk, we start to open our eyes more and look for those guidings as they happen and not always have to look back to recognize it, if that makes sense. So I want to ask you to do a little forecasting now. If you, based on all these experiences, your upbringing, your religious experience, your own decision, life path crossing with Betsy, raising a family, now you're here, I assume, to stay in Lewisburg at this stage of your life. What do you think God is up to right now?
I really think my goal now is to be sure, as long as God gives me breath, to be sure that our grandchildren understand who God is, what He should be to them. I've already had the honor and privilege of baptizing 2 of our grandchildren. And so we've got 4 more to go. And so Betsy and I are going to continue to be sure that we're the positive example that we should be, and that they can see God reflected by our lives.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more specifically. I'm a grandfather myself, and so I'm interested in hearing you say, what kinds of things do you actively do to try to be that influence for them?
Just try to be the proper example. Be sure that they know that Bibi and Papa love them. They're going to make mistakes. We all do. But be sure that they know that there's always a way back. And God is the same way.
Do you have opportunity? I feel pretty confident that you don't have as much time with them as you would like to have because of the distance of where they live, especially the grandchildren that are in Georgia. Mm-hmm. Do you have opportunities to ever sit down and talk pretty seriously to them about spiritual things, or does that just come up in a casual conversation, or how does that work for you?
Most of it is casual. I try not to force things down people, but as opportunity presents itself, try to take that opportunity and seize the moment, as they say. Mm-hmm.
Which, again, leads us back to what we're trying to accomplish here today. When you and I become more in the moment, aware of God's working in our lives, and then we have times like that when we're with our grandchildren, and we're not ashamed to pause and recognize the presence of God, or acknowledge something that God is doing, or praise God even for something as simple as a beautiful sunset. I think those are all teaching moments to teach our grandchildren, even in those rare times that we have with them, or those short times, I should say, that we have with them, to start to think about God at an early age, maybe we have a chance to give them a gift that we ourselves didn't have. And that is somebody reminding us of God's presence even while we weren't otherwise geared to think that way.
I agree, Kyle. A lot of people know that I'm a early morning walker, and lots of mornings, if there's a pretty sunrise, I'll take a picture of it. I'll send it to our children and our grandchildren, and I'll put the tagline on there, God is good.
Mm-hmm.
And just simple things that a lot of times we take for granted.
Are your grandchildren old enough to have their own phones?
Yes.
So do they communicate with you? I mean, if you send a picture, do they respond?
Yes, they do. And we do FaceTime. So even though we're in Alpharetta, Georgia, and there's miles between us, or Murfreesboro, we still have some time to go. Technology is wonderful when it works.
Yeah, I was about to say that's a whole different world than we've ever experienced before.
And they're much more gifted at it than I.
My grandchildren are not to the point yet where we're able to do that, except I will say I have a granddaughter that calls us regularly on accident. So when there's no answer on the other end of the line, we know it's Riley calling. But anyway, I think those moments are important. I think it's good to pick one another's brains a little bit on that, to see what works for you as a granddad and what works for me, because I'm really interested too. And even though not having a lot of time at one given moment to spend with grandchildren, I want to capitalize on those times that we do have. And like you say, not ramming anything down their throats, but just experiencing God with them.
It has to be theirs. I learned that from my own experience. My religion couldn't be my mom and dad, but it has to be mine. One of the things that I have been doing for several years with the grandchildren, once a year, usually at Christmas time, we have a little game, and it's called Who Am I? And I show them pictures of my parents, of Betsy's parents, our grandchildren. We have only one grandchild that got to see one of those people. That was my dad. My dad was the last to pass away, and he was very young. He remembers him sorta. But I go through each of those great grandparents to them, and I talk about their names, when they were born, when they died, what they did for a living, their children. Just try to bring that link to a generation that they didn't get to know.
That's great. That's good to know. Well, Don, I appreciate you taking some time to be with me today, and this has been an enjoyable conversation. And certainly, as always, we want to give God the glory.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me.
All right. That's Don Ledford, and that's this week's edition of Unveiled. You have been listening to Unveiled, a presentation of the Church Street Church of Christ in Lewisburg, Tennessee. I am Kyle Bolton, the pulpit minister at Church Street, and I would like to personally invite you to come be with us during our times of worship and Bible study together. We meet every Sunday at 9 o'clock a.m. for our morning worship, followed by Bible classes for all ages at 10:15 a.m. We meet again on Sunday evenings at 6 o'clock p.m. We also have a midweek meeting for further Bible study on Wednesdays at 6:30 p.m. I would also like to invite you to tune in to this radio station every Monday through Saturday from 6:40 to 6:45 a.m. for our daily devotional program called Upreach. Thank you for listening. Have a blessed day.
In His presence there is comfort. In His presence there is peace. When we seek the Father's heart, we will find such blessed assurance in the presence presence of